Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of A Cup of Joe. My name is Joe Escobedo, and with me on the show today is Shruti Kapoor, who is the co-founder and CEO of Wingman. Now, Shruti, we've known each other for a while, and so for today's session, really want to get your thoughts on, sales call during COVID-19. And you know what, you have a lot of good data points that you've analyzed from sales calls over the past few months. So obviously, I would love to find out what is some of the data telling you. And then between you and I, we'll brainstorm some ideas in terms of how we can overcome some of these challenges or obstacles. Sound good?
Sounds good, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. So maybe, as you mentioned, you will have a presentation you can share with us in terms of some of the data points you did recently on sales calls during COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a few years back, a few months back, as we were all going through the kind of the deepest phase of this crisis, we started asking ourselves the question, there's definitely a lot of conjectural, hypotheses going around, on why people are not buying, right? And we, of course, at Wingman record and analyze sales calls. So we started wondering whether it would make sense to go back and just think about, just look at the data to see why, deals were not closing, what customers were saying. And we found some surprising things. Of course, something that you will learn during today's presentation is what do kids and ROI have in common when it comes to sales. What I would love to do with you, Joe, is kind of look at some of those data points together, brainstorm on what the takeaways should be, both for sales and marketing. Right, so I'll just skip along, and I just wanted to kind of keep this, in the backdrop as we have the conversation, not really, looking to make this a presentation. So this is just, the data that we looked at, right? So we looked at more than 200,000 calls, 1.5 million minutes of recordings, right? And through this, like I said, what we wanted to do was to find out, what are the real blockers? What are people really saying during this period? And I know it's been a tough phase, right? Like most of the time we feel like we've just been hit by a big wave. And it's only now that people are maybe it's time to try and find our bearings again and maybe ride the wave in whatever form and way we can. One of the things that is really troubling, I think, especially for sales teams, is that pre-COVID, 64%, of the companies expected that, more than half of their reps will meet quota, right? And then during COVID, that number went down to 22%, right? And we've seen that while this has happened, not many companies have actually gone back and changed their quota numbers, right? So a lot of this is really being borne by the salespeople. And we've also seen definitely a lot of layoffs among sales teams, right? So it's been a pretty dark period. Things have been changing so fast, it's not been easy for people to kind of figure out, right, how to cope with this. So hopefully some of these data points help us navigate this together. So of course, the first thing we looked at was just are people even willing to talk, right? What we saw early on was that, the number of phone calls, which is largely, cold calls, right? That dramatically fell from February to March, right? And it's not really gone back up, right? While we see that the number of video meetings, has kind of course, also fell, but has been seeing an upward trend. We definitely don't see people being able to make as many cold calls successfully. What are your thoughts, some of the reasons why, people might not be taking those calls or being able to make those calls?
Yeah, it's interesting to see the massive upward trend in video calls.
Yes, I mean, the video calls trend, I think, is also a function of the fact that it's probably replacing some face-to-face meetings, right? And sometimes where you would have had maybe a single call with all of the stakeholders in a room, together, you probably need to do multiple calls, right? With everybody being remote. Um, and I think for the phone calls, the challenge has been that a lot of cold calling relied on, desk phone numbers, which no longer work, right? So people are just not even able to make as many calls because they just don't have enough data for calling people.
Mm.
And like in general, it's harder to find like good mobile phone number data and being able to call people directly. So yeah, that's definitely been a challenge. And I think with events going out of the window, right, and with it being harder to find desk phone numbers, the question to sales and marketing teams is, how else do you do your outreach?
Mm.
The other thing that of course, everybody's been hearing this, right? Like, people are talking about budget cuts, layoffs, budgets being frozen, and more often than not, right, you're going to be seeing people talk about having to go back to their CFO to get a permission for a purchase that earlier wouldn't have been the case.
Mm-hmm.
So we try to see whether that has really happened on sales calls, and of course we see a big trend in this, right? So the blue part of the bar here is the customer talking about it, and the red part of the bar here is the rep talking about it. And so clearly, this is something that has dramatically gone up, both for the customer and the rep, right? Maybe a little bit more for customers talking about budgets, layoffs, and CFOs. And then the question that we asked was, if you know that budget is a concern, then how do you want to tackle it, right? Like, do you want to talk more about ROI, right? Like from a marketing perspective, do you want to create like fancy ROI calculators, maybe on the website, maybe as collateral, or do you want to offer discounts, right? So again, that's something that needs to be thought about strategically. So we went back and again, since we had the privilege of looking at data for this, we went back and looked at, what's really happening. The interesting thing is that people have always talked about discounts, right? Like both reps and customers like to bring this up. And while it has increased, right, it's maybe gone up from being there in 2% of the calls to being there in 3.5% of the calls, right? It's maybe not as dramatic as the increase we saw in the budget, right? And it's also not something that, is just that reps are proactively offering discounts, right? It's been both reps and customers, talking about it a little bit more. And so I don't think it's that COVID related. I think in general, and you also tend to see a little bit of a trend on the end of the quarter, right? So like in June, there was a bigger spike on this. Similarly, in March, you would have expected a spike anyways. What are your thoughts, Joe?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting to see that. It's funny because I've seen the exact opposite when I was working with a tech company and understanding how they spend the budget. Because at the end of the month, you saw the budgets, or so at the end of the quarter, you saw the budgets kind of shoot up because they were trying to spend all the money within that quarter. So it's interesting to see at the same time, while they're spending money on, say, ads and things like that, they're also asking for discounts, which is quite funny. I guess they're trying to get as much as they can out of it. So I think in both situations, it makes sense if you're a salesperson to have those conversations as early in the quarter as possible, because it looks like in January and then April is a bit of an anomaly, but it looks like towards the beginning of the quarter, you see less conversations on discounts, which means hopefully there's less conversation or negotiation around budget. So I think it's good advice, and I think it backs it up. The data backs it up to show that get in there early in the quarter, and then hopefully it'll set you up for the success later in the quarter.
Yeah, and surprisingly, what we also saw was that ROI was really a big one, right? Like if you look at this has gone up more than 2x in terms of people talking about it. And here the increase is significant, again, both for reps and for customers.
Mm.
The thing really is that while people are concerned about budgets and maybe they need more approvals today with, in the COVID world, things being a little bit tighter, at the end of the day, if you're going to be speaking to the finance team or, stakeholders from there, you would need to show ROI, right? And I think that that's a big part of a takeaway for everyone that, while ROI was important earlier, now it is a lot more important. And it's not just about ROI directly. Like one thing, like as I was thinking about this, right, like one of the things you'd want to do is even early on in your, say, cold prospecting, you would want to be able to make your product sound more like a painkiller than a vitamin. And you'd want to focus exactly how, your product might help with, either cost saving or time saving or increase in productivity. Because it's like those are kind of the top of the mind things as people, try to navigate through this lean period in some sense.
Yeah, I think you're always easier to sell the pain versus the gain. But it's interesting to see that massive spike in terms of ROI. I think it goes back to a couple different things. Obviously, your branding, your positioning will have some impact, but also I think bottom of the funnel, looking at content like case studies. In addition to, like I said, the ROI calculators, which I think are a great tool. I think they'll probably need more tangible case studies. You'll probably get more conversations in terms of what have you done? What can you do for us? So I think having those assets already will make the salesperson's job that much easier when they're doing their, their demo calls or they're doing their post kind of follow-ups as well.
Yeah. And then, of course, the other objection that people hadn't, I think, talked about as much, at least when we were looking at, what conversations people were having on LinkedIn, was timing, right? Like a lot of people were saying how budgets are tight and budgets are frozen. But what was really surprising for us here was that if you look at the timing data, right, this has gone from being maybe at around 0.7% to, close to 2.3% or so, which is like, more than a 3x increase over this period. And, like one of the things that immediately came to mind was, deals are just going to take longer to close because people will need more time to get comfortable. They'll need to involve more stakeholders. With your buyers being remote, it'll also probably take them more time to coordinate with each other. And so one of the mistakes that reps often make, and especially when they've been used to these quick closes, right? Like people who are more used to those sub 1 month closing cycles and suddenly that goes up, is a lot of deals just get lost in the pipeline, right? So if you're not really diligent with your follow-ups, if you're just used to, living week on week and doing these quick turnarounds, you're probably going to lose a lot of opportunities by not being diligent. So I think, that's definitely part of it. And so maybe CRM hygiene will come into play. Do you think there's a takeaway for marketing teams here?
Yes, absolutely. I'm actually speaking with a client about this exact same thing. And I think I have, pretty solid background in this because we work with a lot of enterprise companies. So if you're a medium-sized company, you're used to selling a little bit faster because maybe the ticket sizes are slightly smaller. But once you get into enterprise, you understand the importance of nurturing the relationship. And I think this is where marketing really comes into play. So I'll give you an example from a real client we're working with now. They were doing the same thing. So the sales people were going out, doing the outreach and so on, but they were getting conversations like that. They were getting like, okay, it's not, timing isn't great, or look, we don't have the budget this quarter. Let me think about it next. So as a result, there was a massive kind of backlog of deals that just kind of fell to the pipeline because in their mind, sales is like, okay, we have to go over like what's next. We can't wait on these people to make a decision or not. So my advice to them was get marketing involved on the people who are maybe not ready to buy. See how you can still involve them throughout the year in things like inviting them to your webinar, your webinars if it's relevant, getting them into your newsletter. I think these are all activities that the marketing team should own that'll ultimately help unlock those conversations. And the good thing about a lot of this stuff now that's all online is you can have the data. So for example, if you have a newsletter, you can obviously feedback who is engaging with the newsletter on a regular basis. You can have a simple call to action at the bottom and says, get in touch with one of our salespeople for a demo, whatever it is. But at least it helps accelerate the process and it doesn't get lost in the shuffle, because I think at the end of the day, everyone has so many different things to do that, your particular product is not, everything to think about. So it's important to stay on top of mind as much as possible throughout the year, but in a way that's not bugging them. So one of my clients just messaged me this morning about, chasing versus adding into a newsletter. And I said, there's no necessary need to chase. The more you chase, the more you lose leverage in the relationship. And that's where budgets and stuff come into play. Whereas if you would, take a step back, get marketing team involved, see how they can maybe invite them to be a speaker at a coming event or whatever it is, it takes less pressure off the salesperson and it unlocks the deals later down the road.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think it also then plays into the brand, right? Like at least the brand doesn't come across as pushy and shady.
Yeah, I think that's I think a lot of, I've trained about 10,000 salespeople over the past couple of years. And I think that's always one of the big challenges is, how do I follow up my contacts without being spammy? Because that's the worst thing you can do as a salesperson, because obviously it's going to annoy the prospect and obviously it's going to, as you said, reflect poorly on the brand itself.
Yeah. Annoying the prospect isn't kind of the best thing to do. Yeah, and of course, this is just a couple of fun facts that I decided to throw in there, right? As people are all working from home, right, what we see is definitely a lot more disturbance, distraction coming in to those meetings, right? And so, of course, very often we hear the phrase, did you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you see me? Can you see my screen? All those kind of basic things. So what is interesting is that, because there was a baseline of this, right? People saying things like, can you hear me? Right? Or I'm having internet issues. And this has increased a little bit, maybe actually not as much as I would have expected, honestly. But what you see also is that this has increased much more for the reps, right? Not as much for the customers, right? It's actually been pretty stable from February, if you see from a customer standpoint. So maybe in some sense, reps are using this language almost as a nervous tick, and maybe not a great icebreaker or opener. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. I probably have been guilty of it myself, although I try to avoid it. I think there's always that, as salespeople, as people, we try to avoid any nervous pauses. So we try to fill the air with stuff like, can you hear me? Can you see me now? How about now? But it's very interesting to see the big discrepancy in terms of what the rep is saying to the customer, because if the customer is not saying it, obviously it looks like the sales call is more important to the salesperson than it is to the customer. And I think this kind of data reflects that, because the customer couldn't really care if you hear them or not. Like, it's not going to make or break their day, but for the salesperson, it could. If they, they lose that deal or they lose that opportunity, it's going to have a bigger impact on them. So this is actually a very interesting slide. I like this one a lot.
Yeah, and talking about openers and icebreakers, we couldn't not talk about parenting during the lockdown. So we also just went back and looked at, are people talking about their kids on these sales calls? Right, like we all have had, I think by now, instances of kids running into the middle of a meeting, and I think our customers have all, at some point or the other, maybe inadvertently gotten introduced to our kids. So this is another interesting one, right? Like, as I think both of us have kids, right? We would have expected that people would be talking about this a lot more because it tends to be a great icebreaker in some ways, right? Because especially with the lockdown and the kids not being able to go to school, they're definitely a big part of our work day. Um, but what we've seen interestingly is that reps actually haven't taken to this, right? So if you see like the percentage of calls in which reps are bringing up kids, hasn't, changed that dramatically. While of course it has gone up for the prospects, right? Um, I don't know why reps haven't picked up on that signal yet. Any guesses?
Yeah, so there's two sides of that coin. I mean, in the book, The Wolf of Wall Street, or the straight line theory by Jordan Belfort, he kind of teaches you that you should stick as close to that straight line as possible. So you shouldn't, talk about things that are irrelevant to the sale. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is those reps who I've seen very well really understand the customer on a personal level. So not only in terms of what are their KPIs, what does their company do, but also understanding them, do they have kids? What are their hobbies? What are their plans? Where they've traveled to recently? So I think it goes back to the icebreaker as well. One of my previous bosses always told me that um, the best meetings are always like a sandwich. So you start with, an icebreaker that's personal. You get straight to the business in the middle, and then you end it with something that's personal back to it. So I thought that was a nice analogy of packaging it. And it looks like, obviously, going back to priorities, for most of us, it's going to be, our kids. My daughter video bombed one of my client calls last week. But it's interesting to see, as a rep, should we be getting more involved and asking more personal questions? I think if you are generally interested in the other person, it's going to happen organically. So I think that will show, but it looks like based on the data, most of the reps have been on the first side of the coin, which is kind of like, okay, let's talk about the sale, let's close it right now. Which, going back to your earlier slide in terms of timing and timelines, if you have a longer timeline and people are focused on more about their, personal lives and their kids and stuff like that, then it makes sense to build a rapport now, when the timing is actually good, because they'll remember who was a person who was actually interested in them as a person, rather than the sales rep who was just trying to close something that day. So this is very interesting as well.
Yeah, and maybe I was just thinking about this. Maybe it's also because a lot of reps are younger and they don't have kids, and maybe in that sense, maybe they're also less comfortable, kind of bringing it up. They don't know what to do with them.
Actually, yeah, that is a good point. It is easier for us to converse with clients who have kids because we have kids ourselves. So we can swap funny stories, or we can feel each other's pains, that I can say. So when the schools were closed here, like, every parent who had a kid in school who had to do school from home could feel that pain of trying to teach your kids. And I think it's something you could relate to on a personal level. So I think, yeah, that is a very valid point about age making a difference as well.
Finally, an upside to being older.
Exactly.
And like, we were just brainstorming about this with a few of my marketing teammates as well. And one of the things that they came up with was, listen, there are no events happening right now. And so, we don't have much of an opportunity to maybe share, brochures with prospects. So an idea that they came up with was, listen, if everybody is dealing with their kids, maybe like, designing a brochure that is more kid friendly, which, basically has a lot of space and maybe some artwork for them to color, would be a great idea, because then, maybe that's an incentive for our prospect to actually print out our brochures, so they can give it to their kid to color it, or maybe some sort of a origami brochure or something. So yeah, maybe that's something for us to test out.
Yeah, no, I love that. Another thing that came to mind is, because I was just on the call right now, and a lot of clients and people I'm speaking with have like the custom backgrounds. And so making like a, cartoon style or like a animated style background, Zoom background with maybe a small company logo at the bottom would be a nice way to, maybe give it to the kids and say, hey, look, when you're having your calls with, your classmates or your teachers, like, I don't know if they can have that for teachers, but definitely when they're speaking to their classmates, they can have it in the background. And so as a parent, you're maybe going to be jumping in and seeing, monitoring what they're doing. So it'll always be that subtle kind of reminder. So I think going back to your point, I love the idea of the brochure coloring book. My daughter would absolutely love that. So I think, yeah, some interesting ways to incorporate the family into this whole experience.
Yeah, well, we can't avoid it. So we might as well embrace it.
Exactly. Absolutely. So Shruti, I think those are some really, really good points. I think, it's good because I think it validates a lot of the late nights and tension and pressure a lot of the salespeople have faced. I think a lot of times we think we're always in it by ourselves, in terms of deals being delayed or slowed. So I think this helps kind of calm some of that pressure. For me, it also helps understand that for me, I think about it very different. I always think about the long term as well. So I think for most organizations, they've been affected quite, seriously this year, both on the, the vendor side as well as the brand side. So I think everyone's in the same boat. I think we put unnecessary pressure on ourselves, but I think the key for me as well is to think about it from the longer term. So start planning for next year, start planting those seeds for next year and the year after. And, someone on the podcast recently was like, people remember those who have helped them during hard times. And I think this is now really the time to be with your clients and make sure you're supporting them, in different ways, whether it's, the coloring book that are keeping their kids occupied, or, just providing some educational resources. I know some brands have started introducing, online courses because a lot of their clients are, maybe they've been laid off, or maybe they've been kind of, had some downtime because of this. So anything you can do to plant those seeds now, I think are be extremely helpful, come, next year, hopefully when things pick back up.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you can basically pick someone up when they're down, then I think they'll always remember you. And right now is the time to kind of remember that your customers might also be, facing tough situations themselves. So yeah, empathy is king.
Exactly. I think that's extremely important. Like everyone's going through this. It doesn't matter kind of what role or what geography you're in. We're all kind of like taking a hit to the business and our personal lives. So I think, yes, it is important to understand that and kind of, as hard it is for salespeople to kind of pull the reins back, I think we have to during this time. So yeah, Shruti, those are some amazing data points. We're definitely gonna have to have you back on the show to share kind of, hopefully early next year. So we'll have some positive, some data to show, but I think it's always interesting to see kind of, the trends. I forgot to ask the geographic scope for this. I know you guys are global, but the call data, is that globally? Is that from APAC or a specific region?
So that is basically globally across our clients. Most of them are companies in the US or selling into the US. Yeah.
Got it.
There's probably a little bit more US files.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering because I wonder if you broke it down by region, if it had any discrepancy in terms of data, but I think looking at it global makes sense as well. So that was a lot of fun, Shruti. I really appreciate you coming on the show. Really good insights there. I guess the last question is, how can people get in touch with you and find out more about what you do?
Absolutely. So I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. You can just search for Shruti Kapoor, and our company is Wingman. The website is trywingman.com. So yeah, feel free to drop by, and you'll also see my photo there on Intercom.
Awesome. All right. Well, Shruti, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your insights. I've learned a lot. And obviously, if you're watching this, do feel free to share it with your sales team. I think they'll find it extremely helpful. A lot of good insights and a lot of good data that they can use in their upcoming calls and meetings. So thank you guys so much, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Joe. That was a pleasure. Bye.